The wind howled as the storm intensified, its fury ripping through the sky, and suddenly, there was a loud crash. The roof of the pigsty, battered by relentless hailstones, caved in. Emma screamed as she rushed to the window, her heart pounding in her chest. In the swirling chaos outside, the pigs were running in panic, their bodies battered and bleeding from the hail. She could barely see them through the thick, blinding rain, but the sight of their terrified, bruised faces sent a chill through her bones. And then, in the chaos of crashing wood and the deafening noise of the storm, something worse happened. The power went out. The house was plunged into suffocating darkness. She could hear the animals in distress, the wind shrieking outside, and the sickening sound of creaking wood as the barn continued to collapse. Emma's breath hitched. What if we can't save them? The thought made her stomach churn, and for a moment, everything felt as though it was spiraling beyond their control. Chapter 1. A noisy day before the storm. The sun was just beginning to rise over the small town, casting a soft golden glow over the little house nestled at the edge of the village. The garden was lush with early morning dew, and the air was crisp and fresh, full of the sweet scent of blooming flowers and ripening fruit. It was a peaceful morning, the kind that made life on the farm feel like a quiet paradise. John and Emma, a couple who had spent their entire lives working the land, were outside in their garden, content in each other's company. They had worked together side by side for decades, their bond forged through years of shared labor and simple joys. The rhythm of their days was always the same. Wake early, tend to the animals, care for the plants, and find moments of serenity between the hard work. This morning was no different, and yet, there was something in the air. A strange tension, subtle yet unmistakable. John, tall and weathered from years of farm work, was carefully picking the last of the ripe tomatoes, his hands steady and practiced. Emma, smaller and more delicate, was pulling herbs from the garden bed, their earthy aroma filling the air as she tucked them into her apron. The sun hung low on the horizon, the sky a soft pink, and everything felt as if it was suspended in time, just before the world shifted. John glanced up from the tomatoes and took a deep breath. "Do you feel that, Em?" he asked, his voice low, almost a whisper. Emma looked up from her work, squinting slightly against the sun. She nodded, wiping her brow with the back of her hand. "I do," she replied, her eyes narrowing in thought. "It's quiet, too quiet, like the air's holding its breath." John paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. He had spent enough years on the farm to know that the weather could change in an instant, especially when things felt this still. "We'd best get a move on with the animals," he said, a note of caution creeping into his voice. "There's something coming." Without another word, they moved toward the barn where the animals were already stirring, as if they, too, sensed the change. The barnyard was alive with the sounds of clucking, quacking, and snorting. The ducks waddled by the pond, their feathers glistening in the morning light, while the geese honked noisily from the far side of the yard. The rabbits, quiet and alert, watched the world around them with their big, soft eyes. It was a symphony of farm sounds, the music of daily life in the countryside. The pigs were the most eager for attention, their snouts pushing through the slats of the wooden fence, grunting impatiently. John chuckled softly and made his way over to them, rubbing the belly of the largest one, a huge, grunting sow named Rose. "Good morning, Rose," he said, his voice soft but firm. Emma followed, carrying a bucket of feed for the animals. She passed it to John, who began to distribute it to the pigs, watching them snuffle and root around in their pen with greedy abandon. The simple joy of feeding the animals never lost its charm, even after all these years. But as the morning wore on, the animals' behavior began to change. The pigs, normally content and docile, became restless. Rose, who usually enjoyed her meals with a slow, satisfied grunt, was pacing back and forth in her pen, her eyes darting nervously toward the sky. The other pigs followed her lead, snorting and grunting more loudly than usual, their movements jittery and anxious. Even the ducks and geese seemed uneasy, their heads darting toward the horizon as if waiting for something to happen. Emma stood by the pig pen, watching them closely. "They don't like this," she muttered, more to herself than to John. "Something's wrong." John nodded, a frown creasing his brow. "It's the storm," he said, his tone grim. "The air's changing and they can feel it. We've had enough storms in our time to know when the land's about to turn." He turned to head back to the house to check the weather report, but before he could take a step, the wind shifted. The soft breeze that had been rustling through the trees turned sharp and cold, cutting through the fabric of his shirt and biting at his skin. The birds fell silent. The dogs, who had been lounging lazily in the shade, began to bark anxiously, their fur bristling as they paced back and forth. John felt a shiver run down his spine. "I'll check the sky," John said quickly, turning his gaze upward. The once clear morning sky was now filled with heavy, ominous clouds, swirling and darkening with a speed that left him uneasy. A storm was coming, and it wasn't going to be a gentle one. Emma stood at the door of the house watching him. "John, the weather forecast said nothing about a storm like this." He shook his head, his brow furrowing with concern. "Sometimes the old ways know more than the forecast. This doesn't look like any usual summer storm." His voice held a note of warning. "We need to get the animals into shelter before it hits." The wind picked up suddenly, howling through the trees, and the temperature dropped so rapidly that Emma's breath came out in visible puffs of mist. Without wasting any more time, John and Emma hurriedly moved the animals into their shelters. The geese were the most difficult to corral, their flapping wings beating furiously against the wind. But with Emma's coaxing and John's steady hands, they were soon all safely inside the barn. As the last animal was ushered into the shelter, the first heavy raindrops began to fall. They were quickly followed by hailstones the size of marbles, pelting the barn roof with a deafening roar. The wind howled louder, a furious, biting force that rattled the windows and shook the very walls of the house. John and Emma retreated into the house, their hearts racing. John stood at the window, peering out into the yard, his face pale. The hailstorm was getting worse by the minute. He could hear the tin roof of the barn creaking under the assault, and the pounding of the hail against the earth sounded like 1,000 little hammers. The wind whipped around the yard, blowing debris and branches from the trees, and in the distance, he could see the dark, swirling clouds closing in on them, threatening to bring even more devastation. Emma's voice trembled as she spoke. "John, the roof, the barn roof." John turned to her, his eyes widening in horror. The barn, where they kept the pigs, was visible from the window, and he could see that the heavy hail was already starting to tear through the roofing material. He knew it was only a matter of time before it would collapse completely. The thought of the pigs, vulnerable and exposed, sent a chill through his body. Without hesitation, he grabbed his coat and ran toward the door. "Stay inside, Em," he shouted, his voice urgent. "I'll handle it. Just stay safe." Emma nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't want to leave John alone in the storm, but she knew there was no time to argue. As he ran out the door, she rushed to the barn, her mind racing with worry for the animals. Through the howling wind and the deafening roar of the hail, she could hear the frantic squeals of the pigs, the sound of their terror cutting through the chaos. She could see John, his figure barely visible in the storm, moving quickly toward the barn, his face set with determination. But then, with a crack that seemed to tear the very air apart, the roof of the barn gave way. The sound of splintering wood and crashing tin was almost unbearable. Emma screamed, her heart stopping for a moment, but then she forced herself to move. She had to help. She had to save them. John turned to her, his face grim but resolute. "Get inside, he shouted over the storm. "I've got this." But Emma didn't listen. She couldn't leave the animals now, not after everything they had been through together. The storm raged on, its fury unstoppable. And as Emma stood at the edge of the barn, her heart heavy with fear, she knew that this was just the beginning of something far worse. Chapter 2. After the storm. The storm passed as quickly as it had come, leaving behind a scene of chaos and destruction. The wind that had howled through the night now lay still, but the heavy, Oppressive silence was far worse than the storm itself. The sky, once dark and foreboding, was now a pale gray, the clouds retreating as the first light of dawn broke through. The quiet that followed was broken only by the occasional drip of water falling from the trees and the soft rustling of leaves in the morning breeze. John and Emma stood at the edge of the yard, their faces pale, their bodies stiff with the strain of the night's events. The farm they had worked so hard to maintain for so many years lay before them in ruins. The barn, where the pigs had been sheltered, had been hit the hardest. Its roof had caved in under the weight of the hail, the walls splintered and broken. The once sturdy structure now resembled nothing more than a pile of rubble, its beams twisted and shattered. "God, look at this," Emma whispered, her voice heavy with disbelief as she surveyed the damage. John didn't say anything for a moment. He simply stood there, his eyes scanning the destruction, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The sight of the farm, his farm, reduced to this was a blow he hadn't been prepared for. They had lived through bad weather, through floods and droughts, but nothing like this. This storm had been something else entirely. "We need to check on the animals," he finally said, his voice steady but taut. He turned toward the barn, his face a mask of determination. Emma nodded, her heart heavy. "I'll go get the flashlight. It's too dark to see anything properly." But as she turned to head back inside the house, she noticed something was wrong. The house, which had always been their safe haven, felt colder now, emptier. The familiar hum of the refrigerator, the soft whir of the lights, everything was silent. She stepped back onto the porch and looked toward the power lines. The storm had clearly knocked out the electricity. "John," she called softly, her voice trembling slightly, "the power's out." John turned to her, his brow furrowed. He had expected the storm to cause some damage, but he hadn't anticipated losing power. Not now. Not when they needed it the most. "I figured," he said, a wry smile tugging at the corner of his mouth, though there was no humor in it. "We'll manage. It's not the first time." He paused for a moment, taking a deep breath as he surveyed the destruction. "Let's get the pigs sorted out first. We'll figure the rest out after." Together, they made their way toward the barn. The wind had died down, but the remnants of the storm still lingered in the air, heavy and thick with moisture. The barnyard was eerily quiet. There were no sounds of the usual clucking, quacking, or grunting. The animals were all still, as if they were waiting for something to happen. John reached the barn first, his heart sinking as he looked at the broken structure. He could barely make out the figures of the pigs through the debris, their outlines distorted in the dim light. But he could hear them, their panicked grunts, the sound of hooves scraping against the ground in fear. "Help me move this debris," John said, his voice commanding but gentle. He grabbed a large beam of wood and began pulling it away from the entrance, revealing the pigs huddled together in the far corner of the barn. Emma rushed to his side, her hands shaking as she helped him clear the wreckage. Together, they managed to create enough space for the pigs to move. As the last of the debris was cleared, the full extent of the damage became clear. The pigs were in a state of utter panic. They had been thrown about by the force of the storm, their bodies bruised and battered. Several of them were lying on the ground, their sides heaving with shallow breaths. Others were standing, their eyes wide with fear, their bodies trembling. "John, they're hurt?" Emma gasped, her eyes filling with tears as she knelt beside one of the pigs. She gently touched the animal's side, wincing as she felt the sharp lumps of bruises beneath the skin. "They're all hurt. I know," John said quietly, kneeling beside her. "We'll fix them up. We just need to stay calm." The two of them worked quickly, moving from one pig to the next, inspecting each for injuries and trying to calm them down. The barn, once a place of comfort and safety for the animals, now felt like a war zone. Emma carefully cleaned the wounds she could see, wiping away dirt and blood with trembling hands. John, who had always been the more pragmatic of the two, moved methodically, checking each pig for more serious injuries. The storm may have passed, but the damage it had caused was far from over. As they worked, John realized that it wasn't just the pigs who had suffered. The entire farm had been hit. The roof of the barn was barely standing, the walls were cracked, and much of the fencing had been torn down. The storm had left nothing untouched. "I'll go get some supplies," John said finally, his voice steady, though his mind raced. "We'll need bandages, some ointments, anything to help these animals." Emma nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She could see the strain in his eyes, the worry etched into his face. She could see it in her own reflection in the pig's eyes too. They had been through so much over the years, and now this. As John went to fetch the necessary supplies, Emma stayed with the pigs, offering what comfort she could. She whispered to them softly, her hands brushing over their injured bodies, doing her best to reassure them. The cold water from the damaged roof dripped onto her head, but she didn't mind. She had always been able to find peace in the simple act of caring for the animals. But today, the weight of the storm seemed to hang over her like a heavy cloud, one that refused to lift. When John returned, he carried a bucket of cold water and a handful of old cloths. "We'll have to wash them down first," he said. "Clean them up, and then we'll treat the wounds." With a quiet nod, Emma helped him set to work. They began the slow, painstaking process of washing the pigs, using the cold water to soothe their injuries and clean their wounds. Emma winced every time the cold water hit their bruised bodies, but she didn't let it stop her. They had no choice but to carry on, to do everything they could to ease the pain of the animals. There was no room for hesitation, not now. As they worked, John kept glancing back at the barn. "We're going to need more than just bandages and ointment," he said, his voice heavy with the realization. "We'll have to rebuild. The barn's done for, Em. We'll need supplies, labor. It's going to cost us." Emma paused for a moment, looking up at him. Her heart sank at the thought of losing everything they had worked so hard to build, but she refused to let fear control her. She had never been one to give up, and she wasn't about to start now. "We'll find a way," she said firmly. "We always have." John sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "I don't know, Em. This might be bigger than we can handle alone. Maybe we'll have to take out a loan or sell off some land." "No," Emma interrupted, her voice stronger than she had felt in hours. "We'll do this ourselves. We've been through worse, John. We'll figure it out. We always do." John looked at her, his gaze softening. "You're right. We'll figure it out." And so, as they continued to care for the pigs, their hands steady but their hearts heavy, they knew the road ahead would be long and difficult. But with each other by their side, they were determined to rebuild. Not just the barn, but the life they had worked so hard to create. Chapter 3. A Nightmarish Night. The moon hung high in the sky, casting a faint glow over the farm, but it did little to dispel the darkness that had settled over the small house and barn. Inside, John and Emma were far from the peaceful slumber they had once taken for granted. The storm may have passed, but the night brought with it its own kind of chaos, one that they hadn't anticipated. The pigs, though no longer in the state of sheer panic they had been in earlier, still suffered from the aftermath of the storm. Their wounds needed tending, and the farmhouse was far too dark to carry out the task with any ease. "How much longer do you think we'll be at this, John?" Emma's voice was weary, but there was a steady determination in it, as always. She wiped her brow with the back of her hand, trying to focus on the task at hand. It had been a long day, and now it was turning into a long night. John glanced at her, his own exhaustion written clearly on his face. But he didn't speak for a moment, as if he needed to gather his thoughts. He was used to working through fatigue, he had done it for years. But tonight, everything felt different. The farm felt more fragile, the weight of the storm still fresh in their minds. "We'll keep going," he said, his voice gravelly from hours of speaking to the animals and moving debris. "We don't have a choice. We can't let them suffer." Emma nodded, moving toward the pen where the pigs were resting. They were exhausted, but the injuries they had sustained needed more than just time. They needed care. Emma crouched beside one of the pigs, a sow named Belka, who had taken the brunt of a heavy beam during the storm. Her side was bruised and swollen, and she lay unmoving, her labored breathing making Emma's heart ache. "We need to get her bandaged," Emma said, her voice tight. But we're running out of everything. John looked around the barn, frustration building. We have some old bandages, but nothing else that can help her. The ointments and salves are all gone, and it's too dark to even see if she's bleeding. It wasn't just the darkness of the barn that posed a challenge. It was the overwhelming feeling of helplessness that seemed to hang in the air. The storm had already taken so much from them, and now it was pushing them to their limits. "John, the lamps?" Emma said suddenly, her eyes lighting up with a thought. "We need light." John's face fell as he looked at the barn. The electrical outage had rendered the place nearly unlivable. The lamps in the house and barn were completely useless, their bulb sockets cold and empty. Outside, the streets were pitch black, as the storm had knocked out the town streetlights as well. The whole village seemed to be plunged into an unsettling quiet darkness, the kind that made shadows stretch longer and the air feel heavy with uncertainty. "Emma, I don't know what we're going to do. The whole village is without power," John said, his frustration giving way to a slight edge of panic. "And we can't just leave them in the dark like this." Emma took a deep breath, steadying herself. She had always been the one to keep her wits about her when things seemed at their worst. "We'll find a way. We've always found a way." Her words were meant to reassure him, but John could see the worry behind them. He knew she was scared too, though she never let it show in the same way he did. They both continued their work, doing their best to tend to the animals in the dim light that filtered in through cracks in the barn walls. But it wasn't enough. Belka's breathing grew more labored, and Emma could see that the pig's wounds were worsening in the absence of proper care. "John," Emma whispered urgently, "I think she's suffocating." The warmth from the night air and the lack of ventilation in the barn made it harder for the pigs to breathe. The heat that had accompanied the storm's aftermath had turned the barn into a stifling oven. The walls, once sturdy and safe, now felt like they were closing in on them. "We can't let them suffer like this," John muttered, turning toward the barn door. "I'll go find some more blankets to help cool them down. We need to get some airflow in here." But before he could leave, he stopped in his tracks. From the corner of his eye, he spotted something that hadn't occurred to him before. His gaze locked onto the old gas lamp hanging in the far corner of the barn. It had been years since they'd used it, tucked away behind some old boxes, its brass base tarnished with age. But in that moment, it was the one thing that could help them. John moved quickly, his hands shaking as he retrieved the lamp. "Emma, help me with this," he said, his voice now steady with purpose. They worked together, filling the lamp with fuel and lighting it, the soft flicker of the flame casting long shadows on the barn walls. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give them some light, enough to finally see the full extent of the injuries to Belka and the other pigs. "We can manage with this," John said, though he could hear the edge of doubt in his voice. The warmth of the flame felt comforting in a way, but it also highlighted just how much they were still missing. The barn was still too dark, the heat still too suffocating, and the task at hand still too great. Emma turned her attention back to Belka, her brow furrowed as she carefully began to clean the pig's wounds. She worked as quickly as she could, knowing that time was running out for some of the animals. The night seemed endless, the hours stretching on, one after another, each passing minute filled with worry. The darkness outside seemed to mirror the one in their hearts. They were both exhausted, but there was no time to rest. Not now. The storm may have passed, but its aftermath would linger for much longer. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, John stopped for a moment and looked around the barn, taking in the sight of the pigs and the dim light from the lamp. His eyes were tired, and his body ached, but there was still a fire inside him, one that wouldn't go out. "We'll make it through this," he said, more to himself than to Emma. "We have to." Emma, her hands still busy with the pigs, gave a small nod. She didn't speak, but she didn't need to. They both knew that there was nothing they could do but keep moving forward. No matter how dark the night seemed, they had no choice but to press on. As the hours stretched into the late evening, with the oppressive heat and the flickering light of the gas lamp as their only companions, they carried on. They tended to the pigs one by one, doing their best to alleviate their suffering. And though they were both bone-tired and unsure of what the future would hold, they clung to one simple truth. They were still here, together, and they would face whatever came next, no matter how impossible it seemed. But as the darkness crept deeper into the barn, both John and Emma couldn't shake the feeling that the storm was far from over. It was just the beginning of something far more difficult, something that would test their strength in ways they hadn't even begun to imagine. Chapter 4: The Road to Recovery. The morning arrived like a soft, reluctant sigh, the sun's early rays casting a muted golden light across the farm. Emma stood at the stove, the smell of frying bacon and fresh bread filling the small kitchen. The routine of preparing breakfast, once a task she carried out without a second thought, now seemed like a small victory against the lingering weight of the storm's destruction. She had always been a creature of habit, a person who found comfort in the ordinary, the small, everyday tasks that made up her life with John. Yet today, even something as simple as cooking felt different. It felt like they were holding on, one step at a time, trying to reclaim what had been torn from them. As she stirred the eggs, her eyes drifted out the window to the barnyard. The pigs had settled down, their frantic movements from the night before a distant memory. Their breathing, though still shallow and labored, seemed calmer. It was a small relief in a sea of ongoing challenges, but it was enough to bring a flicker of hope. She set the table, carefully placing plates and utensils, and then moved to the door to check on the animals. The yard was quiet, save for the soft clucking of the chickens and the occasional quack of the ducks. It was as if the storm, in all its fury, had left an eerie calm in its wake. Emma looked back toward the barn. The pigs, their wounds tended to as best they could, were resting in the corner of the pen, though they seemed far from fully recovered. Still, they were better. They were alive. John appeared in the doorway, his face smudged with dirt and sweat, his hair more wild than usual. He had been up for hours, working on the roof of the barn, trying to patch up the damage left behind by the hailstorm. She smiled at him as he walked over, taking a moment to wipe his brow with the back of his hand. "How's it going out there?" she asked, her voice soft but filled with concern. John's eyes flickered with a mixture of exhaustion and determination. "Getting there," he replied. "The roof's not going to be perfect, but it'll keep the rain out for now. It's the best I can do with what we've got." Emma nodded, moving toward the counter where the toast had just popped up. "You're doing more than enough. I've got breakfast ready if you're hungry." He shook his head. "I'm fine for now, just trying to get this all sorted before the next storm comes. We can't afford another hit like that." Emma's stomach tightened at the thought. The storm had left the farm in pieces, and the next one, whenever it came, could be their undoing. But she didn't voice that fear. Not now. Instead, she smiled at him, trying to lighten the mood. "Well, when you're done up there, you need to eat something," she said, her voice teasing. "No use fixing the barn if you're going to drop dead from exhaustion." John chuckled softly but didn't comment, turning back to his work. He had always been a man of action, not words, especially when things were as bad as they were now. Every movement he made seemed driven by a quiet urgency, a sense of responsibility that Emma both admired and worried about. He was taking all of it on his shoulders, even the things he couldn't fix. As the morning wore on, Emma moved between the kitchen and the animals, checking in on each of them. She made sure the pigs were still stable, and then went to the chicken coop, which had fared better than the rest of the farm, though she still noticed a few broken eggs in the straw. The ducks and geese, too, had been affected, their feathers ruffled and muddy from the storm's fury. But it was the geese that drew her attention most. One of them, a large white bird she had named Snow, had lost a large feather on its wing. The sight of the missing feather, though seemingly trivial, sent a ripple of unease through Emma. It was a sign, she thought, a sign that something wasn't right. Perhaps the storm had unsettled more than just the barn. She approached Snow cautiously, noticing that the bird seemed unusually subdued, standing at the edge of the pond rather than swimming as it usually did. It was the first time Emma had seen one of her geese so still. She bent down to get a closer look, her fingers brushing the bird's wing where the missing feather had been. "Hey there, Snow," she murmured softly. "What's the matter with you?" Snow didn't respond, its glossy black eyes staring out into the distance, as if lost in thought. Emma's worry deepened, but she didn't know what to do about it. The birds had always been strong and independent, but this sudden change in behavior felt off. She took a mental note to keep an eye on it, hoping it was just a passing phase. But in her gut, she could feel that something wasn't quite right. Just as she turned to head back to the house, a figure appeared at the edge of the yard. She squinted against the sunlight, trying to make out who it was. The figure was familiar. Joe, the neighbor from the farm down the road. He was walking toward her with a purposeful stride, his gait uneven from the years of hard labor he'd spent on his own land. Emma straightened up as he approached, wiping her hands on her apron. Joe was a good man. He and his family had always been kind neighbors. But as he got closer, she felt a familiar unease in her chest. It wasn't that she didn't trust him, but in times like these, when every decision mattered, trusting others didn't come as easily as it once did. "Morning, Emma," Joe called, his voice carrying across the yard. "Heard about the storm. Looks like it did quite a number on your place." "Morning, Joe," she said, offering a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Yeah, we're getting by, trying to piece things back together one step at a time." Joe looked around at the damage, the collapsed roof of the barn, the downed fencing, the muddy yard. His eyes lingered on the wreckage, and Emma could see the pity in them. He was a good man, but sometimes that pity felt heavy, like it came with strings attached. "I came to offer a hand," he said, taking a few steps closer. "I've got a few extra hands back at my place. My boys could help out with the repairs, get things back in shape faster." Emma felt a flicker of hesitation. John had always been the one to handle things on his own. They had never asked for help, and she wasn't sure how John would feel about accepting it, especially from someone else. But Joe wasn't a stranger. They had been neighbors for years. She glanced back toward the barn, where John was still working. He was determined, though the burden of it all was beginning to show. She wasn't sure if accepting help would ease the load or make it worse. "That's very kind of you, Joe," Emma said carefully. "But we're managing. John's doing his best, and we're getting there." Joe gave a knowing nod. "I understand, Emma, but don't wait too long to ask for help. All right? There's no shame in it. Sometimes we all need a little extra hand." He paused, his gaze shifting to the barn. "I'll leave it up to you, but my offer stands." Emma hesitated for a moment longer, then nodded slowly. "Thanks, Joe. We'll think about it." With a final nod, Joe turned and walked back toward his house, leaving Emma standing in the yard, her heart filled with conflicting thoughts. It wasn't the first time he had offered help, but it was the first time in years she had been uncertain about accepting it. She wasn't sure what John would say, and that uncertainty hung heavy in the air, even as she turned back to her duties. The storm had taken more than just their property. It had taken their confidence in knowing that they could do it all on their own. And now, as they faced the long road to recovery, Emma wasn't sure where to turn next. But one thing was certain: whatever they decided, they would rebuild. It wouldn't be easy, but they would do it together. They had no other choice. Chapter 5: Trouble with Neighbors. The morning had started with a sense of cautious optimism, but the warmth of the sun did little to dissolve the tension hanging in the air. The small house, usually so full of the quiet hum of daily life, now felt heavy. Emma noticed it as soon as she stepped into the kitchen. The way John was standing by the window, his arms crossed, staring out over the farm with a furrowed brow. He hadn't said much since Joe had left the yard. "I don't trust him," John muttered, breaking the silence. His voice was low, but the underlying frustration was evident. Emma turned from the stove, where she was scrambling eggs, and looked at him. "Joe? Why not?" "He comes here offering help like it's nothing," John said, shaking his head. "But I know what he wants. He wants something in return." Emma set the spatula down, her hands slightly trembling. "But we need help, John. We can't do this all alone. You're pushing yourself too hard." "I don't need his charity," John snapped, his gaze fixed on the barn in the distance. His face, normally calm and reserved, was taut with something darker now. We've managed before, we'll manage again. But the roof is falling apart, Emma said softly, her voice filled with worry. The pigs, you saw what happened to them last night. We can't keep patching things together like this. John turned to face her, his face softening for a brief moment. I know, but I've never trusted Joe. There's something about the way he looks at this place. Like he thinks it's his. Emma sighed, her fingers gripping the edge of the counter. She knew how much pride John took in the farm, in the life they had built together. To him, asking for help wasn't just difficult, it was almost like admitting defeat. I don't think it's like that, John, Emma said carefully, trying to keep the peace. Joe is a good man. I'm sure he just wants to help. But the more she spoke, the more it seemed like the distance between them was growing. It wasn't just the storm that had shaken them. It was something deeper. The quiet rift that had begun to form when the storm hit was starting to widen. John didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned back to the window, his gaze lost in thought. Finally, after a long silence, he muttered, I'll fix the roof myself. Emma felt a stab of concern. John, you're not well. You're still hurt from the storm. I'm fine, he interrupted, though the sharpness in his voice told a different story. It'll get done. Emma watched him, her heart heavy with worry. She understood his pride. She understood his need to control the situation, to fix things himself. But he couldn't do it alone, not anymore. Not with everything falling apart around them. The day dragged on, each hour filled with small tasks that seemed insignificant in the grand scheme of things. Emma cleaned the barn, checked the animals, and tried to keep everything running smoothly. But every time she looked at John, working tirelessly outside, her anxiety grew. She had seen him push himself too hard before, and it never ended well. The stress, the sleepless nights, the backbreaking work, it always wore him down. The pigs had calmed somewhat after the storm, but they weren't out of the woods yet. And now, as if the universe had decided they hadn't suffered enough, a new problem had emerged. A few hours after lunch, when Emma was in the barn feeding the animals, she noticed the water. It had started to drip from the ceiling. At first, she thought it was just the rainwater collecting from the storm. But when she looked closer, she saw the steady stream of water trickling down from the cracks in the roof. She hurried to the back of the barn where the pigs were resting. A large puddle had already formed beneath Belka, and Emma's heart sank as she realized that if this kept up, the conditions could become worse for the already injured animals. The last thing they needed was to deal with water damage on top of everything else. John, she called, rushing outside to find him. He was on the roof, his silhouette visible against the overcast sky. He didn't hear her at first, so she raised her voice. John! He turned, and when he saw the expression on her face, he knew something was wrong. He quickly descended the ladder and walked toward her, his steps deliberate, though the weight of exhaustion hung on his shoulders. What's wrong? He asked, his brow furrowed. Emma led him to the barn, pointing to the dripping water. The roof, it's leaking. If we don't fix it, the pigs are going to get sick. The wounds. I see it, John said, cutting her off. I'll take care of it. John, please, Emma said, her voice trembling. You can't do this alone. You're not well. Let's wait for Joe or... I'll fix it, John shouted, turning away from her with a sharpness that cut through the tension of the day. His words hung in the air, thick with frustration. Emma stood there, stunned. She didn't know what to say. She knew it wasn't just the roof that was causing this rift between them. It was everything. The fear of losing the farm. The pressure of being alone in the aftermath of the storm. The unspoken strain that neither of them had acknowledged but both could feel growing. As John made his way back to the roof, Emma watched him, her heart heavy with worry. She knew this wasn't about the roof. It was about everything they were facing, everything that was slipping through their fingers. But just as she was about to go inside and prepare for another long, sleepless night, the air seemed to shift. A sudden chill ran through the yard, and the wind picked up, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of rain. She turned her face to the sky, and within moments, dark clouds began to gather, swirling with ominous energy. The storm was returning. "John!" she cried out, panic rising in her chest. But it was too late. The first drop of rain splattered against the earth, quickly followed by another, then another. The sky cracked open, and a gust of wind sent the branches of the trees swaying violently. John was still on the roof, unprotected, unprepared. He looked down at her, his face a mask of determination, and something more, something she couldn't quite place. "I have to finish this," he said, his voice barely audible over the rising wind. "It's too late to turn back now." Emma's heart sank. The storm was back, and with it, the uncertainty of whether or not they could make it through this. Would it be too late? Could they repair everything before the worst of it hit? As the rain began to pour, she watched him on the roof, fighting against the storm, fighting against everything that was threatening to tear their world apart. The tension in the air was palpable, the heavy weight of fear and doubt pressing down on her chest. Would they make it through the storm this time? Would it be the end of everything they had fought for? The answer hung in the balance, and in that moment it was impossible to tell. Chapter 6. Sacrifice for the Animals. The storm howled around the farm, the wind whipping through the trees and the rain hammering down with an unrelenting force. The damage done by the last storm still lingered in the air, wet, heavy, and full of unspoken anxiety. But now, as if nature itself were testing them, the second storm had arrived. It wasn't just a downpour, it was a full-fledged assault, one that threatened to undo whatever little progress John and Emma had managed to make. John, despite the exhaustion from the previous day's efforts, had insisted on going up to the roof to continue his repairs. The storm raged, but he couldn't sit idly by, not with the barn leaking and the pigs still suffering. He stood there, his face grim as he nailed another patch of roofing into place, trying to fight off the constant barrage of rain that soaked him through to the bone. His joints ached, his hands trembled from the strain, but he kept working, driven by a need he couldn't explain. Emma stood nearby, under the shelter of the barn's partial roof, trying to steady herself against the wind. Her hair was matted to her face, her clothes soaked. She watched him, her heart heavy with concern. This wasn't just about the roof anymore. It was about their survival, the survival of their animals, and the very fabric of their life together. The storm had come, and with it, their desperate need to pull everything together, no matter the cost. "John!" she called over the roar of the wind, but he didn't turn, too focused on the task at hand. She moved closer, her boots slipping in the mud, but she didn't care. "John, you can't keep doing this. You're going to hurt yourself." He paused, looking down at her, his face a mixture of frustration and determination. "I have to, Emma. We need to get this done before the animals suffer more." Emma's chest tightened at the sight of him, so focused, so determined. She knew he was doing his best, but his body was worn out, and the storm was too much. They were both too old for this kind of work. "I'll finish here," he added, his voice barely audible against the wind. "You should go inside, stay warm. I'll be all right." She wanted to argue, to tell him it wasn't worth it, that he needed to rest. But she knew deep down that he wouldn't listen. John never did when he had something in mind. She could see that he was running on fumes, but he wasn't about to stop until the job was done. With a defeated sigh, Emma turned back to the barn, where the pigs were. The sound of their soft grunting and the occasional whimper filled the air. Despite all the chaos, they needed her, and she couldn't afford to lose focus. She couldn't afford to let them suffer because of their own struggles. Inside the barn, the situation was just as bad as she feared. The water continued to drip steadily from the ceiling, pooling in various spots around the barn. The floor was slick with mud, and she could see the pigs growing restless, their discomfort increasing with every passing minute. "Hey, Belka," she whispered as she crouched beside the injured pig. Belka's skin was covered in bruises from the hail, her breathing shallow, and she looked far worse than the others. Emma's heart sank. Despite all their efforts, Belka wasn't improving. She needed better care, something more than just makeshift bandages and comforting words. The old barn was barely holding together, and Emma could see the anxiety in the pig's eyes. She had to do something. She couldn't just stand there and watch them suffer. Emma walked over to the small cupboard where they kept their old medical supplies. The storm had knocked out the power, and she had no access to modern conveniences, but perhaps they still had something useful hidden away. Her hands were shaking as she opened the cupboard, sifting through old bottles, jars, and bandages. After what felt like an eternity, she found it. The old first aid kit. It wasn't much, but there were some useful things. A jar of ointment, a few herbal remedies, and a couple of bandages. She quickly grabbed what she could and returned to Belka. She rubbed a healing salve into the pig's bruised skin, using the ointment to ease the swelling. Her hands were careful but swift, knowing that time was running out. Every moment counted. When she finished, she turned to look at the other pigs. They were quieter now, though still uneasy. Emma did what she could for each one, but her thoughts kept returning to Belka. Despite her best efforts, the pig still looked weak, her eyes dull with exhaustion and pain. She needed more medicine, more help. But with the power out and no way to get to the store in the storm, they were stuck. Just then, there was a knock at the door. Emma froze, her heart skipping a beat. No one else had been around for miles, not since the storm began. She hesitated, unsure whether it was a trick of the wind or a real knock. Another knock, louder. Emma rushed to the door, her heart pounding in her chest. When she opened it, she saw the last person she expected, Peter, John's old friend from the past. The man was soaked to the bone, his face grim and tired, but there was determination in his eyes. "Peter," Emma asked, stunned. "What are you doing here?" "I heard about the storm," Peter said, stepping into the barn without waiting for an invitation. "John's not alone in this. I've got tools, I've got help. We can fix the roof together." Emma blinked, surprised at the sudden appearance of her husband's old friend. She hadn't seen Peter in years, and their friendship had grown distant, just like so many things in the past. But now, with the storm raging outside, she couldn't afford to be picky. Peter was here and he was offering help. "John's up on the roof," Emma said, her voice tense. "He's not going to listen to me. He's determined to do it himself." Peter nodded grimly. "I know John. I'll go up and talk to him. We'll get this sorted." Emma stepped aside to let him pass, watching him go. There was something reassuring about Peter's presence. He was experienced, steady, and, perhaps most importantly, he was here when they needed him the most. But as Peter headed toward the roof, Emma stayed in the barn, her mind racing with thoughts of Belka, of the roof repairs, and of the farm that seemed to be slipping through their fingers. She wanted to be hopeful. She wanted to believe that things would get better. But there was a knot in her stomach, a knot that told her something wasn't right. As Peter made his way up the ladder, Emma turned back to the pigs. She felt a familiar weight settle on her shoulders. It was the weight of sacrifice. They had always sacrificed for the animals, working long hours, facing storms, living with little. But now, Emma realized that this sacrifice wasn't just about the farm. It was about something deeper, something she hadn't expected. Suddenly, there was a sound behind her. Emma turned to see Peter standing in the doorway again, his face pale. "There's something I need to tell you," he said, his voice low. "Something about John. Something I should have told you a long time ago." Emma's heart skipped a beat. "What are you talking about?" Peter hesitated. "It's not just the roof that's the problem, Emma. There's a secret John's been keeping. And now it's time you knew the truth." Her mind raced, but before she could respond, Peter's words hung in the air like a storm cloud ready to break. Everything she thought she knew about John, the trust, the years together, the quiet love they shared, was about to change, and the weight of it threatened to crush her before she even knew what was coming. Chapter 7. A Secret from the Past. The rain had ceased, but the damage left in the wake of the storm felt more enduring than any weather. The night had fallen, heavy with uncertainty, and the barn was eerily quiet now that Peter had gone up to the roof with John. Emma stood in the shadows, her heart heavy with the words Peter had left hanging in the air before he walked away. "There's a secret John's been keeping," She couldn't shake the feeling that the night was about to reveal something that would change everything. Her mind raced as she tried to piece together what Peter could have meant. What secret was he talking about? Why hadn't John ever mentioned it? The more she thought about it, the more the knot in her stomach tightened. Minutes passed, but it felt like hours. Finally, she heard footsteps approaching from the direction of the roof. John's figure appeared in the doorway, wet and bedraggled but holding himself upright with that familiar determination. His eyes met hers with a mixture of exhaustion and something else, something she couldn't quite place. He gave her a weak smile as he stepped into the barn, brushing off the rainwater that clung to his clothes. "I'm sorry, Em. I should have told you Peter was coming. But he wanted to help with the roof. I didn't know he'd get involved in anything more." Emma's heart fluttered at the mention of Peter, but she said nothing. Instead, she went to him, offering him a gentle hand as he walked past her. "John, what's going on?" "Peter said something tonight. Something about your past." His eyes tightened, a shadow passing across his face. He stopped in his tracks, and for the first time that evening, Emma saw something in him that she hadn't seen in years. Hesitation. "Peter's got a way of making things complicated," he murmured, his voice quiet. I didn't want you to know. It's a part of my past that I've tried to forget." Emma stepped closer, her heart aching. "What happened, John?" John let out a long sigh, his shoulders slumping under the weight of something much heavier than the physical exhaustion from the storm. "Years ago, before we ever met, I was part of something I didn't want you to know about. I got into a bad situation, a dangerous one. Peter was involved. We both were." Emma frowned, her chest tightening. "What kind of situation?" John was quiet for a long time, his eyes looking anywhere but at her. When he finally spoke, his words were laced with regret. "It was a mess, Em. There were debts, dangerous people, things I never should have gotten involved in. Peter, he tried to help, but we got caught up in it. I ended up taking the fall for both of us." Emma's mind raced as she processed what he was saying. The John she knew, the John who had always been so steady, so reliable, was caught up in something dark, something dangerous. She could hardly wrap her mind around it. The man she loved, the man who had built this farm with her, wasn't the person she thought he was. He wasn't just a quiet farmer who loved animals and cared for the land. He had a past that was full of shadows. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked softly, almost afraid of the answer. John shook his head, looking older than he had just moments ago. "I didn't want you to see me like that. I didn't want you to look at me the way you're looking at me now. I didn't want you to know about the mistakes I made." But Emma's gaze softened. She reached out, taking his weathered hand in hers. "I don't want to know about your mistakes, John. I just want to know who you are now. Who you are with me, with us." He met her eyes, his own filled with a mix of guilt and something that resembled hope. "I'm sorry, Em. I didn't mean to keep this from you, but I've changed. I swear I have." For a moment, Emma didn't know what to say. The man she had loved for so many years, this man who had built a life with her, was someone different, someone she hadn't known. But he was still the same John who had worked beside her every day, who had cared for her, who had built this life for them both. Could she forgive him for his past mistakes? Could she accept that he was more than just the man she had married? Before she could respond, there was another noise, an urgent one this time. The sound of a cow mooing in distress. Emma's heart skipped a beat. John, the cows. They rushed outside, their previous conversation forgotten for the moment as the situation shifted. There, in the corner of the barn, one of the cows, Bessie, was lying on the ground, unable to stand. Her body was shaking, and she had an odd, labored breath. "Bessie!" Emma cried out, rushing to her side. John dropped beside her, his hands trembling. "She's sick. I don't know what's wrong with her. We need to help her, fast." But as John tried to steady Bessie, Emma's mind was still clouded with the weight of the conversation they had just had. This was becoming too much. Their farm, their animals, their entire life. It felt like it was all falling apart. Could they fix it? Could they rebuild after all of this? "What if we can't fix this, John?" Emma whispered, her voice breaking. What if we lose everything? John didn't have an answer. Instead, he worked quickly, checking Bessie's vitals, trying to assess the situation. The storm, the past, the roof, it was all pushing down on them. But Emma couldn't let herself break down. Not now. She had to focus on the animals, on the farm, on their future. After a tense moment, John stood up, wiping his hands on his pants. We need to act fast. We've got to get her to a vet. But with the storm and no electricity, I don't know if we can manage it. Emma nodded, determination filling her chest. We'll figure it out. We always do. But even as she said the words, she couldn't shake the feeling that things were changing. And not necessarily for the better. The weight of the past, the burden of their farm, and the truth about John's former life were all coming together. Emma knew that the decisions they made in the next few days could determine everything. Later, as they worked together to tend to Bessie, their bodies tired and their spirits heavy, John looked at Emma and spoke again, his voice gentle but firm. You know, maybe it's time to ask for help. Emma paused, surprised by the suggestion. What do you mean? John's eyes met hers. Maybe we can't do this on our own anymore. Maybe it's time to trust Peter. It was a hard thing to admit, but for the first time in what felt like forever, Emma saw hope flicker in John's eyes. Maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for things to get better. And with that thought, she felt the weight in her chest lighten. Together, they would face whatever came next, even if it meant accepting help from a man who had once been a stranger in their lives. But the real question still loomed. Would they be able to face what came from John's past? The chapter closed on the uncertainty of the moment, with the storm outside now nothing more than a distant memory. But the storm inside their hearts, one that had yet to be fully weathered, was only just beginning. Chapter 8: Broken Hopes. The days had been heavy, and the burden of managing the farm felt like an endless weight pressing down on John and Emma. The storms had passed, but the aftermath was worse than they could have ever imagined. Their farm was struggling. The roof repairs were temporary at best, and the crops, once thriving in the warm soil, had wilted under the relentless pressure of the past few months. What had once been a promising future was now filled with uncertainty and the harsh reality that the farm was no longer the place of hope it had once been. John sat at the worn kitchen table, his head in his hands, staring at nothing in particular. His fingers drummed absently against the wooden surface, the rhythmic tapping the only sound in the otherwise silent room. The weight of the situation was crushing, and despite his stoic exterior, Emma could see that he was unraveling. She had tried to stay strong, to hold on to the belief that they could make it through this together, but the cracks were starting to show on her own heart as well. Emma, we can't keep going like this, John muttered, his voice hoarse. We can't keep pretending everything will turn around. We're losing money every day, and the animals, they're not getting any better. I don't know what to do anymore. Emma's heart sank as she stood by the counter, watching him. She wanted to tell him that it would be okay, that they could fix it, but the words seemed hollow even to her. The animals, once the vibrant center of their life, were now just reminders of the struggle they were in. The pigs, the cows, even the chickens, all of them were sickly or injured in some way, each one needing special care and attention. Despite all their efforts, they were losing the battle. She moved quietly to John's side, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. We can't give up, John. We can find a way. We just need to figure out what that way is. He lifted his gaze to hers, his eyes filled with a mixture of exhaustion and something deeper, something she hadn't seen in him before: doubt. I don't know, Emma. Maybe it's time to face the reality. The farm's not going to survive. Maybe we need to sell it. Maybe that's the only way out. Emma recoiled at the suggestion. The thought of losing their home, the land they had worked so hard to cultivate, was unbearable. It wasn't just a farm to her. It was their life, their dreams, everything they had built together. She opened her mouth to argue, but the words got stuck in her throat. She had no idea what the right answer was anymore. The money was tight, and they had already sacrificed so much. Their savings were almost gone. and the bank was beginning to make its presence felt in ways that could no longer be ignored. "I know it's hard, but we've got to keep fighting. There has to be another way," Emma said, though her voice lacked the conviction she wished it had. "Maybe we need to think about other ways to make money. We could sell some of the animals, start selling produce at the market again, or maybe there's something else we haven't thought of." John didn't reply. He just stared out the window, where the sky was overcast and gray, a mirror to his thoughts. His silence only made the heavy atmosphere in the room more suffocating. Later that afternoon, Emma found herself in the barn, tending to the pigs. The wind had picked up again, sending gusts of cold air through the cracks in the barn walls. She moved quickly, trying to keep warm, and checked on each animal one by one. They were all still in poor condition. Some were still covered in bruises from the hailstorm, while others had developed a cough or were sluggish from the lack of food and proper care. Her heart broke every time she saw them. They had always been so lively, so full of energy. Now they barely lifted their heads when she approached, their eyes dull and tired. She did everything she could, cleaning them, feeding them, making sure they had water, but it felt like it was never enough. She couldn't help but think of the one pig that had been most affected by the storm, a sow named Pearl. Despite her best efforts, Pearl's condition had worsened over the past few days. The bruises from the hail had turned into painful, open wounds, and no matter what Emma did, she couldn't seem to help her. It was a hard truth to face, but Emma had to accept it. Pearl wasn't going to make it. She stood in front of the pig, tears welling up in her eyes as she stroked Pearl's bruised side one last time. "I'm sorry," Emma whispered, her voice shaking. "I tried everything I could." Pearl's breathing slowed, and before Emma could say anything else, the pig let out a soft, final exhale and closed her eyes. The death of Pearl was the final blow for Emma. She had held on to hope for so long, clinging to the idea that if they worked hard enough, they could make it. But losing Pearl felt like the loss of everything they had fought for. Her heart felt hollow as she stood in the barn, surrounded by the animals who were still in need of care and attention, knowing she couldn't keep up with it all. John found her later, standing outside the barn, staring at the horizon. He didn't have to ask. He knew. "I'm sorry," Emma said quietly, her voice breaking. "I couldn't save her." John walked up to her and placed his hand gently on her shoulder. "You did everything you could, Emma, but sometimes things just don't work out the way we want them to." They stood there for a long time in silence. The wind whistled through the trees, and the scent of rain still hung in the air. But despite the quiet, the weight of their unspoken thoughts pressed on both of them. "I don't know if I can keep doing this," John admitted, his voice soft. "I don't know how we can keep going when it feels like everything is falling apart." Emma turned to him, meeting his gaze. She knew that his words were filled with more than just concern for the farm. He was tired of the struggle, tired of fighting a battle that seemed endless. She could see it in his eyes, the defeat that had started to take root inside of him. But then, as they stood there, something shifted. A figure appeared in the distance, walking toward them. It was a man, a neighbor they knew only vaguely. He waved as he approached, his face serious but determined. "I heard about what happened," he said, nodding toward the barn. "I wanted to offer you some help. I know someone who might be willing to buy some of your livestock. It could be the money you need to keep things going." Emma's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't the answer she had hoped for, but it was something. It was a lifeline, even if it meant letting go of some of what they had fought so hard to keep. John looked at the neighbor, then back at Emma. "I'm not sure," he murmured. "What if this isn't enough? What if it's just another temporary fix?" But Emma felt something shift in her. The decision wasn't easy, and it wasn't perfect. But maybe, just maybe, it was the chance they needed to keep going, to keep trying. "We'll figure it out," she said softly, squeezing his hand. "We always do." And as the neighbor left, with the promise of a potential deal, Emma and John stood together, uncertain of what the future held, but resolute in the belief that they couldn't give up just yet. Despite the broken hopes that had come to define their days, a small spark of hope still remained. Chapter 9, hope in dark days. The days following the neighbor's offer were filled with uncertainty. John and Emma stood at a crossroads, the future of their farm hanging in the balance. The offer was a lifeline, one that might provide the funds they so desperately needed to keep the farm afloat. But there was always a catch, wasn't there? It was never as simple as it seemed. They met with the neighbor in the barn the next day. His name was Arthur, a tall, wiry man with a weathered face that spoke of years of hard labor. He seemed sincere enough, but there was a sharpness in his eyes, a quiet intensity that made John uneasy. He had promised to buy several of their pigs, providing them with much-needed cash. But the deal wasn't without its conditions. Arthur had suggested they sell not only the pigs but also some of their land, the land that had been in their family for generations. John looked at Emma, his face tight with worry. He had always been protective of their land, the place where their dreams had been built. It wasn't just earth beneath their feet. It was a part of who they were. But the reality of their situation gnawed at him. The farm was sinking, and their resources were nearly gone. Maybe this was the only way to save it. Emma, on the other hand, felt a deep sense of unease. She trusted their neighbor, but the idea of selling their land was a bitter pill to swallow. It felt like giving up, like letting go of the one thing that had always defined their lives. But at the same time, she knew that they couldn't keep living in denial. Something had to give. After a long silence, John sighed, his shoulders slumping. "It's a tough decision, Em, but I don't know if we have much choice." Emma nodded slowly, trying to keep her emotions in check. "We can't lose everything, John. We can't lose the farm." But what were they supposed to do? The pigs were improving slowly, but the repairs were costly, and the price of feed had risen. Their savings were almost gone, and they still had to cover the cost of medical supplies for the animals, as well as the damage to the barn. No matter how much they tried to hold on, it felt like the ground was slipping out from beneath them. As if things weren't difficult enough, a new conflict arose. Their friends and neighbors, who had always been supportive, now found themselves on opposite sides of the issue. Arthur had made it clear that if they accepted his offer, they would have to sell more than just the pigs. They would have to allow him to buy a portion of the land. John wasn't sure he was ready to let go of that, but Emma saw things differently. She was desperate. Maybe selling part of the land was the best way to keep the rest of it intact. The disagreement over the land led to tension in the community. Some of their neighbors believed Arthur's proposal was a good one, seeing it as a way for John and Emma to recover financially. But others, including their longtime friends, felt that selling land would be the end of the farm. It wasn't just about money anymore. It was about principle, about holding on to the things that mattered most. Late one evening, as John and Emma sat down for dinner, the weight of the situation pressed heavily on them both. The small house, once filled with the warmth of shared laughter and long conversations, now felt cold and empty. They were both tired, exhausted from the long days of work, from the constant worry about the future. It felt like no matter what they did, they couldn't escape the harsh reality closing in around them. "Do you think we're doing the right thing?" Emma asked quietly, her voice betraying the doubt that lingered in her heart. John looked at her, his expression unreadable. He had always been the one to keep things together, the one who made the tough decisions. But now, with the weight of everything pressing down on him, he wasn't so sure anymore. "I don't know, Em," he admitted, "but we can't keep going like this. If we don't do something now, we might lose everything. Maybe it's time we take a step back and think about what's best for us, for the farm." Emma's heart ached at the thought. She wanted to believe that things would turn around, that they would find a way to make it work. But she also knew that they couldn't keep fighting the inevitable. Something had to change, and she wasn't sure if they had the strength to face the choice that was in front of them. The next morning, as they stood in the barn, feeding the pigs and checking on the cows, a small ray of hope began to appear. The animals, though still needing constant care, had started to recover. The bruises on the pigs were fading, and their appetites had returned. The cows, too, were slowly regaining strength. Emma felt a flicker of optimism. Maybe, just maybe, they could make it. But the financial strain remained. The money from the pigs, if they sold them to Arthur, could help, but at what cost? The land, the heart of everything they had worked for, was now at risk. The thought of selling it felt like a betrayal, but Emma knew deep down that they didn't have many options left. And then came the letter. It arrived with the Morning Post, its envelope bearing the logo of the bank. Emma hesitated before opening it, already knowing what it would say. The bank was giving them one final warning. If they didn't come up with a solution soon, the farm would be foreclosed. The news hit them like a blow. They were running out of time. Later that day, John stood alone in the field, looking out over the land that had been his family's for generations. It had been passed down to him by his father and his father before him. Every corner of the property, every tree, every fence held memories. Memories of hard work, of sweat and laughter, of long days and quiet nights. But now all of that was on the line. He thought about the offer from Arthur. He thought about the bank's letter. And most painfully, he thought about what they would lose if they didn't act quickly. The decision was torturous. Emma joined him in the field, her steps slow, as though she, too, felt the heaviness of the moment. "We can't keep going in circles, John," she said softly. Maybe it's time we trust Arthur. Maybe he's the only chance we've got." John's heart clenched at the words. He had always been the one to make the hard decisions, but this one felt different. This wasn't just about saving the farm, it was about trusting someone else with their future. "I don't know if I can," John whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "But if we don't, what's left for us?" And so, they stood there, in the fading light of the afternoon, at the crossroads of their lives. The choice was theirs: to take a risk on the future, to trust someone else, or to keep fighting alone with everything at stake. And as the sun set behind them, John knew that the hardest part wasn't making the decision. It was living with it. Chapter 10. A New Life. The weight of the decisions John and Emma had made began to shift, slowly but surely, from burden to relief. It had been a long and difficult journey, but after the harrowing weeks of uncertainty, the farm was beginning to show signs of life again. Each day, their hard work and determination were paying off, little by little. The first major breakthrough came when the pigs, their most pressing concern, started to heal. The bruises that had marked their bodies from the storm were now fading, and their once listless eyes began to shine with life again. John and Emma, working tirelessly every day, took turns tending to their wounds, administering medicines, and making sure they were fed well. Emma had become a skilled nurse in her own right, knowing just what each animal needed, and John was always by her side, ready to support her with his steady hands. The roof repairs, though done in the harshest of conditions, had been completed just in time to prevent further damage from the unpredictable weather. The barn was whole again, and with it, a renewed sense of hope. It was not perfect, but it was theirs. The structure held firm against the wind and rain, a testament to their resilience and their refusal to give up. It was the same spirit that had kept them going through the darkest days. The spirit of love for their farm, their animals, and each other. One afternoon, as Emma walked through the yard, she noticed something that made her heart leap. The electric meter, which had been out of service for weeks, was blinking back to life. The lights in the barn flickered on, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, the hum of power surged through their house. Emma rushed inside to tell John, her face alight with excitement. "We have electricity again," she said, breathless with joy. John looked up from the trough where he was feeding the cows. He didn't say anything at first, but the relief that crossed his face was unmistakable. The weight that had been pressing down on them for so long, the worry of keeping the farm running without power, seemed to lift. Now they could cook more efficiently, warm the barn for the animals during the cold nights, and even fix some of the machinery that had been broken. It wasn't a magic solution, but it was a step forward. And at that moment, it felt like a victory. As the weeks passed, the animals thrived. The pigs regained their strength, the cows were producing milk again, and even the geese and ducks waddled around the yard, content in their pens. Emma spent her mornings washing the animals, combing through their feathers, and making sure they were comfortable. She enjoyed these simple, peaceful moments more than she had ever realized. With each act of care, she felt a connection to the earth and the creatures who lived on it, a sense of fulfillment that was rooted in the quiet satisfaction of knowing she was doing something meaningful. In the evenings, John and Emma would sit on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The breeze was gentle, carrying the scent of earth and fresh grass. The farm, once so chaotic and filled with the sting of worry, was now peaceful. The air felt lighter, and their home, though modest, was filled with warmth and love. It wasn't just the animals that had healed. They had, too, the stress of the past months, the fear of losing everything, the financial strain, the doubts that had haunted them, was still there, but it no longer defined their days. They had come through it together, stronger and more united than before. They had learned that even when life felt like it was falling apart, there was always something to hold on to, something worth fighting for. For John and Emma, that something had been each other, their farm, and the life they had built. One evening, as they sat side by side in the rocking chairs on the porch, John took Emma's hand in his. It was a simple gesture, but one that spoke volumes. "We made it, he said quietly. She smiled softly, leaning her head against his shoulder. "I knew we would," she replied, her voice calm and content. The animals had all been fed and were resting comfortably in their pens. The house was warm, the fire crackling in the hearth. The kitchen smelled of fresh bread, and there was the hum of the wind outside, gentle and soothing. It felt like the world had slowed down just for a moment, as if everything was in its rightful place. John and Emma exchanged a look, one that carried all the unspoken words between them. Their love for the land, for the animals, for each other, was the quiet foundation of their lives. It wasn't glamorous, but it was real. It was their life, and it was enough. The days ahead would no doubt bring their own challenges. There would always be work to do, and the seasons would change, bringing with them new tests and new triumphs. But for now, as the stars began to twinkle in the night sky above the farm, John and Emma felt a deep sense of peace. They had weathered the storm, both literally and figuratively, and had emerged on the other side, stronger and more united than ever. As the sound of contented animals filled the night air, John and Emma, in their quiet, humble home, found joy in the simple things. They had their farm, their animals, and each other, and for them that was enough. Their story, one of struggle and resilience, had come to an end, not with an extraordinary event, but with the quiet satisfaction of knowing that they had made it. They had found peace in their work, in their love, and in the small, everyday moments that made life worth living. And in that peace they found a new life,